Hey. So, we're going to talk about A Mercy, page 1 to 20 right now. So, first, you could just take your book out and your notebook out and something to write in your notebook with. I would appreciate that. I will just wait here for a minute while you do that. Okay, now that you've done that, I'm going to give you a little assignment right now. So, oftentimes, I had a writing teacher in high school who talked about authors would put seeds in their books, right? Directors would do this too with movies. And seeds are little ideas, and it could be a symbol, it could be something somebody says, it could be, some idea or something that they put in the beginning, and then that has some significance at the end. So, some of the seeds that they plant are ideas that are going to come up later, some are not, right? So, what I want you to do first, before I just kind of talk through this chapter, is I want you to turn to a human seated in the immediate vicinity of where you are. And if you are on the right hand side of the room from where I would be facing, actually, from where I am facing on this big screen, right hand side, you're going to look at pages. So you're going to look pages 3, 4, and 5. Sorry, the camera's going crazy in earthquake. And then the left-hand side of the room is going to look at pages 6 through 9. And I'm just going to have, if it's okay with the sub, if they push pause, and give you about 6 or 7 minutes. What I want you to do is, this will be an assignment, you're going to turn this in. Right-hand side of the room, those first couple pages, I want you to read through those and just write down ideas or things which appear like they might be seeds. Something that seems like it's significant even though that we don't know what it is yet. So jot those things down, and then after 6, 7 minutes, if the sub could just collect those, and then push play on the video again, then I'll just kind of talk through that section. Bye. See you soon. I'm back. Now, you've turned that in. So we get some things that are put in here, and I think that the author, Toni Morrison, intentionally makes the beginning kind of confusing and puts some things in there which don't make sense so that we can, it makes us curious as to what these things mean and want to read a little bit more. So chapter 1, and this is a confusing book. This is probably, if not the hardest, the second hardest book. I think Scarlet Letter is probably a tougher book than this, but because of the language and the sentences are so long in that book. But this one, everything's disjointed, right? We're going to get stories kind of told out of order, and we're going to have to work first on just kind of developing a chronology of what happens in the story, right? From the beginning to the end, what happens. Because then, with each even number chapter, we're going to get some information about one of the characters. So, for instance, in chapter 2, as we'll talk about in a minute, we learn about Jacob Bark, and we get his story, right? And in getting his story, we also learn some about Lena. We learn some about Rebecca, who is his wife. We learn some about Florence and some of the other characters that are prominent in the story. Okay, so once we kind of get that timeline of this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then that's the end of the story, then when different parts of the book are mentioned, you can kind of place on the timeline where in the book we're at, or where in the story we're at. So in the beginning on page 1, this starts, and it's written to somebody, if you notice. Don't be afraid, my telling can't hurt you in spite of what I've done, and I promise to lie quietly in the dark. So in terms of seeds on this first one, it sounds like she messed somebody up, right? She will never again unfold her limbs to rise up and bare teeth. So she did something, she injured somebody quite badly. And then she goes on and says, you can think what I tell you a confession if you like. Now, confession is one of those loaded words, right? It could mean several different things. You could confess to a crime, right? You could, so as in something you did wrong. This could be something that you've thought for a long time that I have a confession. This has been a secret that I haven't been able to tell you for a while. But something, right? Now, we get a couple in terms of more seeds on this page. We get a couple of ideas, and these are signs, right? So for the first sign, we get curiosity is familiar only in dreams and during the moments when a dog's profile plays in the steam of a kettle, and when a cornhusk doll sitting on the shelf is soon splaying in the corner of the room, and the wicked of how it got there is plain. Those are two different ideas, right? And we get, steam rising of a kettle, if you've ever made tea or whatever, excuse me, and then the steam rose up in the shape of a dog, the face of a dog, and then also a corn husk doll, right? So if you've ever husked corn and made it into a doll, which I think is usually what you do in the fall, I think corn husk dolls are popular with the young people these days, I've heard. Anyway, then going on, it says, another is, can you read? Okay, we're talking more seeds. These are things which could show of importance. And so whoever she is speaking to or writing to, she's asking. Now, in terms of things one can read, One can read books. One can read text, as in like what she's writing, literally. One can read people, right? Be a good judge of character, and those signs, like I was talking about, right, with the steam rising. And it said she should have known that it was a sign when I say Minhame. Now, they speak Portuguese as their native language, so Minhame is my mother, standing hand with her little boy. Other sign, and then so she remembers this, and she should have known that meant something. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Other signs need more time to understand. Often there are too many signs. Okay, now going on down the page a little bit. Page 4, if we're talking signs, it talks about the beginning begins with shoes. Sometimes an author will put a statement like that in a book, right? And you can tell that this is an important, the author is calling special attention to this, right? So when she was a kid, Florence, who is the first person speaker in this, liked to wear high-heeled shoes. And it says, Lena says, right, and we'll find out who Lena is in a bit, that her feet are useless, will always be too tender for life, and never have the strong soles, tougher than leather than life requires. So, this is a story about Florence, right? She's going on some type of journey. She has to go undergo some type of quest or something. And it said, so there's only a couple of things that could happen to her. One, her feet could toughen up, right? So, or her feet are too weak and she can't make it. So we'll see whether that happens. Now we get a little hint of what's coming later when it says, so when I set out to find you, mistress gave me sir's boots that fit a man, not a girl. So whoever she's writing this letter to, she also set out on a journey to find. Right? We don't know who mistress is yet, but we will find that out. On page 5, it said, my head is light with confusion of two things, hunger for you and scare if I'm lost. Excuse me. Now, on this journey, to find this person, whoever she is writing to, in terms of seeds on this page, we kind of get placed in the middle of the action here, right? And this is kind of a technique that modern movies use regularly, where they just start and everything, they start the movie not at the beginning, but right in the middle of the action, and then they try to piece together how we got to that point. Going on down the page, going on to 6 and 7. Now we get some more flashbacks, and this is at various points in her life. It said, we boil wild plums for jam and cake 8 times since then, so I must be 16. Now, Florence's story, and that's a little bit of what we get in this chapter, and what's going to happen at the end, flashes back to earlier in her life, and she is going to be given away by her mother. Now, we'll get some information about why that happens, and we're also going to see that scene from a couple different perspectives, both at the end of chapter 1 and also into chapter 2. But this has a very big impact on her, right? And so she never is going to be able to find out exactly why mom did what she did, but she will learn the lesson that mom hoped that she would learn. So when she was still with mother before she was given away, she was taught English by Reverend Father, which is illegal to do. And it said, when the letters are memory will make whole words, I'm faster than my mother and the baby boy no good at all. And so very quickly, Florence, it says, I like talk. Lena talk, Stone talk, even Sorrow talk. Best of all is your talk. Lena and Sorrow, 2 more characters. Now, I realize this is very confusing in the beginning, and like I said, I think it's intentionally so. All these people will start to get straightened out, and we'll start working on our chronology here in a second. Going on down the page in 7, we get a couple other characters introduced, Will and Scully, and we don't know who they are in terms of seeds. We get some characters' names mentioned. And then 8 and 9, this is where we have some important things here. So this is the scene, and at the top of page 8, we're going to get this scene from Florence's perspective right here, and then next chapter we're also going to get it from Jacob's perspective. And also, this is another technique that movies frequently use. There's a number of movies where you would see one event, right, from multiple different either viewpoints or perspectives. I forget what that's called. But anyway, so from Florence's perspective, it says, Sir saying he will take instead the woman and the girl, not the baby boy, and the dead is gone. Aminahime begs no. Her baby boy is still at her breast. Take the girl, she says. My daughter, she says. Me? Me? Sir agrees and changes the balance due. Now, Jacob was collecting payment on a debt that Senor Ortega owned, right? So he had lent Senor Ortega money, and we get all this story in the next chapter, right? But here we just get a little bit of it. And Senor Ortega was a slave trader, and he had a ship full of slaves, and a lot of them died, right? And rather than sell the slaves that he owned, that he still had left, he waited for another ship to come with more slaves, but that ship never arrived, right? So he ended up losing a great deal of money. And he was worried that no one would lend him money if he didn't pay off his debt. And so since Jacob was the one who lent him the money, when he went to Dortega's place, and this is basically the story of chapter 2, Dortega offers him a slave. And Jacob is not interested in a slave, but in the end he does end up taking one. And so at this point, when it says, he points at the woman, and this is the story we're getting from Florence's perspective, and the woman, who's Florence's mother, said, not me, take her. So when requesting Florence's mother gave Florence to Jacob. And this is from Florence's perspective, so we don't she doesn't understand anything more than that. We'll get this whole story here and again in a second. And then the rest of bottom of page 8 and the top of page 9 is Florence's journey to Jacob's house. Hang on. Sorry, I got four young boys between the ages of 6 and 9 running around screaming at each other. Anyway, they're my children. 2 of them are. It's not just random ones. Anyway, I forget exactly where I was at. Mom gives her away. And then the remainder of page 8 is her journey to Jacob's house. Right now, when we get there, why don't you take out... I won't have you take out a piece of paper. We'll talk chronology. I'll just kind of talk you through it, right? If I was going to tell you the story of the book from the beginning to the end, right? Jacob arrives from Europe, and he'd inherited some land, right? Once he gets there, Jacob's the guy we meet, at the beginning of chapter 2, walking along the coast, right? The beginning of the story arrives when Jacob arrives from Europe. We'll get a little bit of that information, and he has inherited some land. He purchases the first slave, Lena. Lena's a Native American, and we'll get her story a little bit later. Jacob treats slaves differently than most people that you would associate in a slave-owning relationship, right? He's kind. I mean, the slaves he owns have to work, but it's something, especially as more and more people move to the farm, both slaves and also his wife, something much closer to a family, right? Jacob himself was an orphan, and so he feels a great deal of pity for orphans. And in a situation like Florence, he felt bad for her, right? And so he took her, and she was very sad about that because she never really understood why that happened, but he took them in. So after he had purchased Florence, then he sees an advertisement for basically a mail-order bride from Europe named Rebecca, and he ordered her. So then she showed up, and she was a pretty young woman, and when she showed up, Lena was also living there, and the two of them were about the same age, and so there was initially some jealousy and fighting between them, but very quickly they became friends, right? So again, this is kind of subverting that typical slave owner-slave relationship where, you know, if they were a family, they would all have to work all the time, right? Because of all the harvesting the crops and all the stuff you have to do on the farm. If you're not working all the time, you don't make it through the winter, right? So some of the slaves, especially Florence, as she grows up there, doesn't really even understand slavery as an institution because to her, she just, she lives at Jacob's farm and she has to work all the time. But so does Jacob, and so does Rebecca, and so does everybody who's there. So then, after Rebecca comes, then Jacob also purchases, he receives Sorrow, and we'll find out about her later. She's another woman and coming from a kind of strangely troubled place. And then shortly after that is the beginning of chapter 2, which is where we are, right? And so by this point, Jacob's married. They've had several kids, and he's on his way down the coast to collect these debts from Senor Ortega. Okay, once we have chapter 2, and in terms of the timeline of the story, as he's leaving Senor Ortega's, so Dortega's is where he receives Florence, and then shortly after, on his way out, leaving Dortega's house, he turns around and kind of admires his house and says to himself that he would like something like that, where he's from. He would like kind of a monument to himself, a big fancy house, right? And this is going to be kind of a turning point in the story where things are going to start to change. Okay, so most of the things that happen in the story are going to kind of happen on that timeline. Once he starts to change and build this big house, a whole bunch of really bad things happen. Okay, so we'll get to that. Anyway, as it is right now, on page 11, he's on his way down the coast. And page 11, at the bottom of the page, talks about this story was written in kind of pre-America, right? So it's not an established country yet. And I think you've talked about Bacon's Rebellion in history class. So at the bottom of page 11, we get a reference to that. And it said half a dozen years ago. So Bacon's Rebellion would have been, 6 years before where we are in the historical timeline. An army of blacks, natives, whites, mulattoes, freedmen, slaves, and indentured had waged war against a local gentry led by members of that very class. When that people's war had lost its hope to the hangman, and the work it had done, which included the slaughter of opposing tribes and running the Carolinas off their land, spawned a thicket of new laws authorizing chaos and defensive order. By eliminating manumission, gatherings, travel, and bearing arms for black people only, by granting license to any white person to kill any black person for any reason, By compensating the owners for a slave's maiming or death, they separated and protected all whites from all others forever. Now, this is kind of an important historical point in our country, right? Even though it was pre-country. Because that law said any white person can kill or injure any black person for any reason and not be punished. Now, that's significant, right? And so in terms of Jacob disagreed with this, and he said, in Jacob Vark's view, these were lawless laws encouraging cruelty in exchange for common cause, if not common virtue. So he said what these laws were put in place is to allow white people to treat black people very badly. Now, going down the bottom, page 12, we get some more information about Jacob. And if you were writing this paper, because in previous years I've taught this in B and you would actually be writing an essay on this, we get some information about Jacob. Anytime you're watching a movie or reading a book and a character does something, especially near the beginning, that doesn't seem to have any impact on the plot. So, for instance, here he's riding down the coast and he sees a raccoon trapped in a tree. And it said, Jacob urged the mare to a faster pace. He dismounted twice, the second time to free the bloody hind leg of a young raccoon stuck in a tree break. Regina munched the trailside grass while he tried to be as gentle as possible, avoiding the claws and teeth of the frightened animal. Once he succeeded, the raccoon limped off, perhaps to the mother forced to abandon it, or more likely to other claws. Now, that doesn't make the plot change at all. Nothing has really happened, right? It hasn't advanced the story at all. But in doing that, that tells us something about Jacob, right? So when you watch a movie or read a book, if the character does something which doesn't seem to affect the plot, a gesture, a conversation, something like this, that's in there to tell us who that person is without the author having to come out and say it. Now, riding down the coast, onto page 14 and 15, we get some other information about Jacob being very respectful of nature. And another thing you can think about when you read books and watch movies, if a character is described as being a very particular way. So in this instance, we also have, in addition to the raccoon stopping, it said, when he sailed on the South River into the Chesapeake Bay, he disembarked, found a village, and negotiated native trails on horseback, mindful of fields of maize, careful through the hunting grounds, politely asking permission to enter a small village here, a larger one there. He was very careful, right? And so if a character is described as being very much one way, typically what happens is they end up kind of changing, right? There's a reason all that description's in there to set up what ends up happening to them later. Now, going on, he shows up at Dortega's place, and initially he is disgusted by Dortega. Dortega's plantation is called Jublio. And on to page 18 and 19, he sits down and has dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Dortega, and he is disgusted by all of them. He doesn't like the fact of how much money they've spent on things they don't need, like they're burning candles during the daytime. and so he said, I don't have that quote. Anyway, basically he said, because they waste their money on frivolous things like this, they're never going to be able to survive any setback, right? And so he doesn't like the wife, and he feels a strong difference between the two of them. And on page 19, we get a little of that difference pointed out again. And if you remember the raccoon scene, it said, dinner was a tedious affair, made intolerable by the awkwardness Jacob felt. His rough clothes were in stark contrast to embroidered silk and lace collar. His normally deft fingers turned clumsy with the tableware. There was even a faint trace of raccoon blood on his hands. Now, hang on one sec. Sorry, almost done. Anyway, raccoon blood on his hands, to point out the difference between the two of them, right? His clothes are dirty and smelly and old and, rough. Theirs are fine silk, and he's still got blood on his hands. Now, that blood on his hands is going to come up another page or two as he washes it off, which is another symbolic thing that you can think about. So that is where we're at. I hope the first 20 pages make a little bit more sense after that. Again, if you're confused, that's okay. I think you're supposed to be a little bit. So you're going to read page 20 to page 40 for tomorrow. I'm at the U of M today, so I will be back tomorrow. Bye.